So let's turn back to Bojack himself. Why is Bojack intent on remaking this house and putting in all this labor? It's uncharacteristic for him, right? He's notoriously lazy. He works so hard on this house. I think there's several points here. Most obviously, given everything I've said so far, by putting everything back together and bringing order to all of this chaos and bringing stability to all of this broken stuff that has no integrity, he's making sense of himself. He's building a coherent self out of the pieces of his past. He's not just finding it. It's not that just that he goes back there to experience his memories and figure out retroactively by looking back who he is, but rather that he needs to put together all these little pieces of his past into something coherent that is built and stable and not just found. And he feels like he needs to do this. Remember why he's doing it, or what triggered it at least. It's triggered by Sarah Lynn's death and that enormous bender he went on where he was apologizing randomly to all kinds of people and didn't know what he was doing and was blacked out and there was no coherence whatsoever. And all of that lack of coherence ended in tragedy. And so here he is responding to that. So that's the first point. He's trying to put himself back together. I think also it's important that he's doing it in this isolated environment. Usually, we've seen this over and over again, Bojack looks to other people to hand him a self. He wants to figure out who he is by being recognized by other people. Usually this is by being recognized as a character in a TV show that he's been in. So he finds his identity as the horse from Horsing Around, or later it will be as the main character in Filbert, right? We've seen him in a few TV shows, and he in general identifies with his characters to a large extent because they're public, and looks to other public forms of recognition of him to figure out who he is. But here, for once, he's trying to figure it out all by himself. He's isolating himself and trying to do that work, that identity work, without the help of public recognition or even other people. Interesting point about that, by the way, when his neighbor Eddie is first introduced and fixes his door for him, he tells Eddie that fixing the door was a dick move. Why would it be a dick move for Eddie to do him a favor? I think it's because it's central to his sense of what he's doing there, that he's doing this by himself with no help for other people. That's like a real switch for him and something that he feels is important. Although I think later in the episode, as he comes to be friends with Eddie and count on his help, he realizes that it is okay to have genuine relationships with others and rely on others to do some of this work. It's just that you can't rely on them to just hand it to you and do it for you by just taking over all that work for themselves, right? So there's a subtle metaphor that's, I think, continued throughout the episode here between the work that's done in building your identity through the recognition of others and the work that's done in reconstructing this house with the help of others. It's okay for other people to help. It's not okay for other people to take over. And it's not okay for you to just hand it off to them. And that's a distinction he has to learn throughout. Okay, so first point about remaking the house was bringing order to himself and building a coherent self. Second point was about doing it in isolation, doing it by himself. And then I think that there's a third point, which we've seen before, which is the existentialist point about needing to find purpose in action and not just in one's inner life. I think that Bojack realizes, I actually think that for most of this episode until the end, we see Bojack at his most admirable. He's wiser here than he usually is. He wants to actually work on the house, not just contemplate things. He's trying to find meaning through activity, through work with his hands and with his body. He realizes that if he just sits there and dwells on what went wrong and on his loss of Sarah Lynn and on all of the terrible things that he's done, it's not going to make any kind of progress for him. And remember Todd saying to him, you can't just do shitty things over and over again, then be sorry. You have to actually be better. So being better requires activity, not just contemplation. So for him, this project of remaking the house is a way of trying to be better and find himself through actual embodied work rather than just through introspection and dwelling on himself. When he's almost finished and he thinks he's finished and Eddie thinks he's finished, he notices that the weather vane on the top is still missing, and he decides that he absolutely has to find that weather vane. This is an interesting moment. Right? It's not just that he wants to rebuild the house and make it livable. He wants to make the house exactly the way that it was before. Why? Why does it matter so much that it's exactly the way that it was before? I think that there's two answers going on to that question simultaneously in the episode. One is no reason, right? It doesn't really matter that it be exactly the same. But what does matter to him is that this project that he's taken on, that he does it perfectly, that he fully commits himself to it. So it's neither here nor there in the grand course of things that the house be identical to how it used to be. But since he has committed himself to this project of reconstructing the house, and since he is in this mode of trying to fully commit himself and really work on something for once, it just matters for its own sake to him that this be perfect rather than, that he do this perfectly. And here I think we can go back to Sartre on radical freedom. Right? Remember, Sartre says it doesn't really matter what you choose and what you commit to, but whichever thing you choose, you have to throw yourself into that choice fully. You have to own it completely. You have to not have any bad faith and say, oh, well, it's not my fault that it didn't really turn out or whatever, or it's not my fault that I made this choice. You have to pick it and throw your entire self into it. And so here he really is doing that, right? He's throwing his whole self into this project. And we know that it doesn't really matter to him because ultimately, in the end, he destroys it anyway. In fact, I'm going to come back to this passage, but let me find the quote, right? At the very end, Eddie says to him, what was this all for? And he says, I don't know. I guess it was just a big waste of time. So exactly reconstructing the house doesn't have any greater purpose or anything like that. The commitment is for its own sake. And I think that this plays well off of the stuff we've talked about in Sartre and also the stuff that we've talked about in Camus, right? It's a very deeply existentialist idea that the purpose in doing this doesn't come from some outer imposed value or goal. There's no purpose beyond itself. The purpose for doing this exists just in the action and in the commitment. Okay, so I said there were two reasons. Right? That's one reason why I think he needs to find the missing weather vane, is just out of a perfectionist sense of fully committing himself to the project. I think that the second reason is just he's not ready to be done, right? He doesn't feel like he's done everything there that he's come to do. He's not ready to move on. And so he's looking for an excuse to continue the project. That seems pretty clear in terms of his gesture and body language. And then by the end of the episode, he really is done. There's two scenes in the episode that mirror one another that I think we need to talk about. So the grandmother, towards the end of the episodes, goes on this manic drunk driving binge, which is also clearly a kind of a suicide attempt, when she just doesn't know what to do in the face of her loss and has no sense of who she is and no sense of purpose whatsoever. She starts driving around wildly with Beatrice in the car, clearly sort of half intending to smash the car and not caring if she takes Beatrice down with her. And then we see almost the exact same scene as that. Really, it's kind of cool. If you look at how the scenes are drawn, they're really parallel in terms of their rhythm and movement. At the end of the episode, when Eddie is confronted with the loss of his wife, he goes on a very similar manic, semi-suicidal flight where he takes Bojack along for the ride. And he doesn't care if Bojack is going to go down with him. He doesn't care if Bojack dies in the process. So these are really interestingly parallel moments. And I think they represent this idea that if you have this total loss that makes you unable to tell any story about yourself that makes sense, then it can feel like there's just no reason to continue at all. But it is also interesting that they both drag other people into their suicidal plans. Eddie and Bojack, furthermore, at the end of the wild flight, end up underwater. And remember, I told you, we know that what this means now in the course of the series. Whenever people end up underwater, underwater represents a loss of self and a sense of complete place disorientation and not being able to understand what you should do with yourself or where you are. And that's clearly what happens here. This is, Eddie is the one now who is at a loss in just that sense. That takes us to the very end of the episode, which I think is designed to be kind of tragic. I think most of the episode, like I said, is about Bojack being exceptionally wise and exceptionally committed. And as I read it at the end of the episode, he just basically gives up and loses his nerve. And all that self-building that he's been doing and his attempts to free himself from needing the recognition of others and to make sense of his own past and reconcile himself with the various traumas that define his family history and his origins, he throws it away. At the end, he calls Diane, who he's been avoiding, and he talks to her, and she reminds him of his own advice about Los Angeles. And she says, everyone belongs, and he should go back to Los Angeles because everyone belongs there. There's no barriers to entry, as she puts it. Los Angeles in the show, as both Diane describes it here and as Bojack described it to her earlier, and as we see it portrayed, Los Angeles is a place where you can shed and ignore your origins. You can let go of any rootedness in place, and you can let go of the demons of your past and not try to make sense of yourself. And instead, because everybody in Los Angeles is constantly trying to be famous and the whole culture is one of celebrity, Los Angeles is a place where you are allowed to live through the recognition of others, right? You're allowed to live through the characters you play on TV and through your celebrity status and through your image and how you're seen, rather than building a self for yourself. If you think about it, if you go back to what I said about bad faith and start on bad faith, that Los Angeles lifestyle where you depend on others for self-building is kind of the ultimate bad faith, right? You take no responsibility for making your own self. You just figure out who you are through looking at how others see you. And so then you can blame them for who you are because they're the ones who see you that way. Anyway, Los Angeles is a place where he doesn't need to do identity work for himself. He doesn't need to have any origins or come to terms with his origins. And basically, Diane talks him into going back to that much shallower, bad faith version of himself. And right after she says this to him, notice that they then have a big shallow gossip session where they just start talking about celebrities and what they did. And it's a total LA conversation, which is just all celebrity oriented, and it's not about anything real. And then right after that, he goes back and he destroys the house. I think this is a real failure of nerve for Bojack. In this episode, we really see him for one of the first times really growing, really being willing to do work, and really incorporating these horrible, traumatic past stories from his origins and his ancestry into himself, figuring out how they help make him. And then he bails. He goes back to his old self. And in fact, the last thing he says pretty much is he ends with Sarah Lynn's catchphrase, suck a dick, dumb shits. He says it as the house that he built collapses. This is like his goodbye to this newly built self. And saying this phrase, which is associated with Sarah Lynn, seems to reassert his connection to Los Angeles, but also to his horsing around family, his fake family, rather than the family that he is trying to connect with here, as horrible as it is, right? Sarah Lynn is his horsing around fake celebrity daughter, not his real daughter. And by saying her catchphrase and going back to LA, he's letting his carefully stage-managed, fictional, horsing around version of himself and horsing around version of his family become the one that he identifies with all over again, even though he was finally getting past that. Why does he actually tear the house down? Is this for Camus-like reasons, right? One thing we might say is, well, he tears the house down because all that mattered was the actual activity and process of building it. The end result was irrelevant. I said that earlier. I think that's real. So in some sense, it's true that the final product doesn't matter. He also, though, tears it down because he's giving up on this new self and he's running away from it. It was more authentic, but it was also more painful and harder to maintain. So back to that final conversation, Eddie says to him, what was all this for? And he says back, I don't know. I guess it was just a big waste of time. But you can't change the past. Time's arrow marches on, but you can't change the past. Now, this is an incredibly important sentence. And a few episodes later, that phrase comes back and we get an entire episode called Time's Arrow, which I'm going to talk about in detail next. But that claim that time marches on and you can't change the past is a really complicated one in the show, right? In some ways, it's a deep truth about the show, and in some ways, it's deeply wrong-headed, and we keep seeing examples of how it's not true. I think one of the big philosophical questions that the show asks us is that right? Can you change the past? Does time only move in one direction? I'll come back to this even more when we talk about Time's Arrow, but think about it. On the one hand, yes, it's true. You can't change the past in the sense that his past is there and it's shaping him whether he wants it or not. He can flee back to Los Angeles and into his fictional self and into his celebrity persona. But that past is there and shaping him whether he wants it or not, right? He's going to have substance abuse problems because of his mother no matter what. He's going to have traumas from how he was treated by his parents no matter what. On the other hand, it's an ironic thing for him to say at the end of this episode in particular, Time's arrow marches on, as if time moves in only one direction, because time in this episode in particular definitely doesn't move in just one direction, right? The storytelling here involves moving around in time, back and forth in time, and it's not one directional. We make sense of the past through what's going on in the present, and vice versa. We make sense of the present through what's going on in the past. And often the two are overlaid on top of one another simultaneously, and we're only understanding each story through the other story. And what we see here is that the past can take on new meanings. Right? We see Bojack give it new meanings, and we see Eddie give it new meanings. Remember, I talked about this a lot in the last lecture. It was my central theme for the season, that there's always fantasy and imagination involved in making sense of our own stories. And that means any time that we're going to make sense of the past, we're going to have to imaginatively reconstruct it in certain ways, and we're going to have to impose fantasy on it in certain ways in order to turn it into something that is a narrative we can understand. And that means that the past can, in a sense, change, right? We can retell that story in different ways. We can imagine it differently. We can fill it in differently. From what we know about the science of memory, and dreams too, actually, but memory is more relevant right now. From what we know about the science of memory, this is exactly right. Our memories are not nearly as coherent and filled in as we feel like we are. What we actually have is really fragmented, incoherent little bits of memory. And our sense that when we look back, we can remember entire stories that make sense is almost all our brain reconstructing and imaginatively filling in. We don't like to think that because we like to feel like our memories accurately reflect reality, but the reality is that so much of our memory is imagination work. And if that's true, then the past, at least insofar as it's available to us at all, really can change. So yes, you can't change the past, and Time's arrow marches forward in the sense that much as we would like to, we can't just shed it. It will shape us. But on the other hand, no, we can change the past because we can keep retelling it and understanding it in new ways, and it can take on new significances, and it can also come back to haunt us. And so time is not linear. Okay, I'll stop for now.